So section 1.9 is the last section that we cover in chapter 1 other than the practice test. And it's an important section because it has some theoretical concepts that come up frequently this semester. The theoretical part that we need to deal with, we need to learn some properties of real numbers. The commutative property, the associative property, maybe I'll skip the identity property, and then something later called the distributive property. The commutative property is a rule that allows me to switch the order of the terms in a problem that has either two terms being added, and then maybe I'll use a proper word here, or two factors being multiplied. Terms are separated by pluses and minus signs, factors are being multiplied. And what do I mean? Well, I wrote over here that if I have two terms being added, like I have the numbers 2 and 4 being added, the commutative property for addition says if I have two terms being added, I can switch the order. I could put the second term first and the first term second, and they're going to equal the same. 2 plus 4 is equal to 4 plus 2. Those are both equal to 6. So if I have two terms being added, I can switch the order. And similarly here, I wrote that a plus b, this is two terms being added. I can switch the order and keep the plus sign. The commutative property for adding doesn't work for subtraction. If I wrote 4 minus 2, I can't switch the order and say that equals to 2 minus 4. The commutative property works for addition, it doesn't work for subtraction, because 4 minus 2 is 2 and 2 minus 4 is negative 2. Those aren't equal. So the commutative property works for addition and not subtraction. It works if you have adding with two terms. The commutative property of multiplication says if you're multiplying and there's two factors, that I can switch the order. 3 times 4 is the same as 4 times 3. Those are both equal to 12. Similarly, a times b with or without a times sign equals to b times a. If there's two numbers or variables being added, the order is switchable. If there's two numbers or variables being multiplied, the orders are switchable. Doesn't work for division. Like if I gave you something like 4 divided by 2, that doesn't equal 2 divided by 4. 4 divided by 2 is equal to 2. 2 divided by 4 is the fraction 2 over 4, which equals to 1/2. So these rules, the commutative property works for addition problem, adding two terms, works for multiplication, multiplying two terms, and it allows me to switch the order. The next rule that we'll learn is the associative property, and it allows me to move parentheses. And the associative property, I don't change any order like I do in the commutative property. The associative property either needs 3 terms being added with 2 in a parentheses, or it needs 3 factors being multiplied with 2 in a parentheses. So if I have a problem that has 3 terms being added and there's a parentheses containing 2 of them, I can use the associative property for addition. If I have 3 factors being multiplied, 2 in a parentheses, I can use the associative property for multiplication. And let me just write it here. The associative property for addition would apply to this problem that I wrote, that 1 plus 3 plus 4. This is 3 terms being added, 2 in a parentheses. I'm allowed to move the parentheses. Instead of putting the first 2 terms in the last 2 terms in a parentheses, I can move the first 2 terms in a parentheses, leaving all the plus signs. It only works if all the signs are plus or all the terms are being multiplied. This side right here, if I was order operations simplifying it, that's going to be 1 plus 7, which is 8. This side, if I was order operations on it, it would be 4 plus 4, which is 8. It works for variables the same way, and it doesn't matter if the parentheses are written first or second. Like if I had something like x plus y plus z, this is adding 3 terms, 2 of them are in a parentheses, straight addition. I don't switch the order of the terms, but I can move the order of what's grouped. X plus y in a parentheses plus z is equal to x plus y plus z. Works the same way for multiplication, doesn't work for subtraction or division. So for multiplication, if I had 3 terms or 3 factors being multiplied, like 2 times 3 times 5, 3 factors being multiplied, 2 of them in a parentheses, this is going to equal to moving the parentheses 2 times 3 times 5. Because the left one, I do the parentheses first and then the multiplication. The right side, I do the parentheses first and then the multiplication. They'll equal the same value. Similarly, if I have 3 variables being multiplied, 2 of them in a parentheses, I can not switch the order. I left these alphabetically, but I can move the parentheses and those will equal each other. So that's kind of 4 rules, but really 2. Commutative, switch the order. You need 2 terms either being added or multiplied. Associative, you move the parentheses. You need 3 terms, 2 in a parentheses. Now I'm going to jump into the problems until we get to the new concept that we're going to worry about. The identity property basically says anything plus 0 is itself. 5 plus 0 is 5, plus 6 plus 0 is 6. The identity property of multiplication basically says any number times 1 is itself. 3 times 1 is 3, 10 times 1 is 10, x times 1 is x. So the problems between 1 and, I don't know how far it's going to go, 1 and 20 or so, want me to use either the commutative or the associative property, and it tells me what rule to use. 2 says use the associative property of addition. This is can work because I have 3 terms, they're being added, 2's are in a parentheses. So to apply the associative property, I don't change in order. So the y has to stay first, the 2 has to stay second, the x has to stay third. I just need to regroup. Instead of this time having the first 2 terms in a parentheses, I'll put the second 2 terms in a parentheses. I want to have this on my screen, but I don't think I can fit it. I can't so much. Oh well, it is what it is. 4 and 3 want me to use the associative property of multiplication. Both 3 and 4 have 3 factors being multiplied, 2 in a parentheses. That means the associative property allows me to move the parentheses. So I'm going to leave the 7 first, the A second, and the B third, and I'm just going to change the parentheses. And when I do this, there's lots of ways to write the answers because there's, not in terms of the order, but there's different ways to represent multiplication. I generally would fall for this, that I wouldn't put time signs anywhere in my answer because the time signs are implied. I use the associative rule of multiplication. I had 3 factors being multiplied, 2 in a parentheses, I move the parentheses. This is a frustrating kind of problem because there's lots of ways to write your answer that are all equally right. I could put a time sign between the 7 and an A. I could put a time sign after the parentheses before the B, or maybe I could just have a time sign between the 7 and an A and not have the time sign after the B. So what's important is I moved the parentheses, I kept the 7 first, the A second, and the B third, and then I wrote something that meant 7 times A and then times B. And anything that you write is going to be right if the multiplication is either written or implied and the order is right and the parentheses are in the right position. 5 and 6 want me to use the commutative property of addition. Commutative property requires either adding or multiplying two numbers or variables. And in commutative property, I just switch the order. So to apply the commutative property of addition, the plus sign stays, and I just switch the order of what's given to me. So y plus 9 is adding, and the commutative property of addition says I can keep the plus sign, switch what's being added, the order of what's being added, and it's going to equal to the original problem. So the answer for 6 is going to be 9 plus y. Your 5 should be similar. 8 wants me to use the commutative property of multiplication. Commutative property requires either two factors being added or two factors being multiplied. If I have two factors being multiplied or two terms being added, I can just switch the order and make this into 9y. Should check some answers. I hate to write down wrong answers and have my video wrong forever. So real quickly, I've been lazy and haven't been checking my answers. I'm going to check really quickly. That's okay. That's okay. That's okay. And now my 8. Feeling good. All my answers are correct, so I don't have anything horribly wrong. I might have fumbled on a word or two, but that's adequate. 10 wants me to use the commutative property of multiplication. And in problem 10, I have two factors. I have one factor of x minus 2. That's considered my first factor. And it's multiplied by the second factor of 5. The commutative property says if you have two factors being multiplied, the commutative property of multiplication, that you can just switch the order. This is an important skill right here. This is how we're going to use this skill to do some simplifying later this semester. So this is more complicated, but it's still multiplying two factors. That first factor is an odd-looking factor, but the commutative property of multiplication allows me to rewrite any multiplication of two factors. X minus 2 is the first factor, 5 is the second. All right, your 9 should work the same way. And now we're getting ready to get on to a new rule, and it's probably the most important rule in this section. It's the rule that comes up again and again and again and again. And it's the distributive property of multiplication over addition, or the distributive property of multiplication over subtraction. The rules are written here with an example, but let me do some examples. Like if I had something like 3 times 5 plus 6, the distributive property allows me that if I have a number being multiplied by a parentheses, that I can distribute to clear the parentheses. It says if I have a times b plus c, that this is the same as a times b, in this case 3 times 5, plus a times c, in this case 3 times 6. So this would be applying the distributive property. Of course, this simplifies. Orders of operations would make this 15 plus 18, which is 33. So there's 4 different rules here, and they all kind of work the same way. The first two are distributing multiplication over addition. If I had written this parentheses backwards, if I wrote 5 plus 6 times 3, as long as I have factors written like this, I can use the distributive property. And the second version of this says if I have a parentheses with two terms plus sign between, I can clear the parentheses by taking each term in the parentheses, distributing it through, leaving the sign between, and multiplying each. So this is going to be 5 times 3 and 6 times 3, which is going to be what, 15 plus 18. and that's 33. I know that these had to be equal to each other because this and this are rewritten using the commutative property of multiplication. If there's a negative inside the parentheses, no big deal. If I made this like 2 times 8 minus 5, the rule says this is going to be 2 times 8 minus 2 times 5. This is going to be 2 times 8. Leave the minus sign between, and then 2 times 5. I'm distributing the 2 through the parentheses. So 2 times 8 is 16, minus 2 times 5, which is minus 10. This whole thing would be 6. And if I flip-flop this and wrote something like 8 minus 5 times 2, I can apply the distributive property by going 8 times 2 minus 5 times 2. This would be 8 times 2, keep the minus sign, and then 5 times 2, which is going to be 16 minus 10, which will be 6. So that's overly simplified what the rule is. Now let's do some examples and see how we can deal with them. So 12 wants me to rewrite using the distributive property. I'm going to keep the plus sign between the terms, and I'm going to take the 7 and multiply it by the 5, and I'm going to take the 7 and multiply it by the 3. That's rewriting using the distributive property. Now I'm going to do and simplify. The 7 times 5 is 35. The 7 times 3 is 21. And 35 plus 21 is 56. Ultimately, I think the only answer you really need is the 56. But when I wrote my answer, I wrote first. I showed the distributive property clearing, and then I simplified it. Problem 14, it's kind of the reverse. To clear the parentheses, I'm going to leave the plus sign between. I'm going to take the 5 in the left parentheses, multiply it by the 9 out front. I'm going to take the 2 in the left parentheses and also multiply it by that 9. Basically, I'm taking both terms in the parentheses, multiplying it by the 9. This is probably part of the answer that I wrote because that's rewriting using the distributive property, and it asks me to simplify. This is 5 times 9 is 45. 2 times 9 is 18, so this is 45 plus 18, which if I haven't messed up is 63. I think I included both in my answers. I'm peeking at my answers here. I'm having a hard time finding it, but that is exactly what I wrote. Your 15 that you can't see doesn't work similarly. It works more like 15 works more like 16, so let me put both these on the screen. 16, I'm going to rewrite using the distributive property. I'm going to leave the minus sign between. I'm going to multiply the 7 by the 5 and the 7 by the 3. And now I'm going to do orders of operations, do the multiplications first, and then do the subtraction. Should be writing equals because everything I'm writing is equal to the original problem. My answer would have this. This is considered rewrite using the distributive property. And it's going to have this because that's the and simplify. So your 15 should work the same way. I got misaligned here. And our problems 17 and 18 work the same way. If I can get these on the screen. My problem 18 is like your problem 17. I'm going to keep the minus between. I'm going to multiply the 1 times the 9 and multiply the 2 times the 9. The 1 times the 9 is going to be 9. I should write an equal sign because it equals to the line above it. The 2 times the 9 is 18. And this is the rewrite using the distributive property. And this I can do without rewriting it, but this you can rewrite it as 9 plus negative 18. The and simplify part of this is going to be negative 9. Turns out that your problem 19 is more like my problem 20. I just have to respace these. I just didn't break them properly. And let's just do your 19. I'm going to leave the plus sign between. and do the 5 times the x and the 5 times the y. This is the nicest way to write the answer for 19 because it doesn't have the time signs that are unnecessary. Lots of distributive properties because it's a hugely important rule. I did 19, which was like 20, so let's work on 21 and 22. 22, I'm going to leave the plus sign between. I'm going to multiply the x times the 9, and I'm going to multiply the y times the 9. This is considered rewritten using the distributive property. I can't really simplify this, other than I can apply the commutative property of multiplication. And probably a better way to write 22 is 9x plus 9y. I applied an extra rule, and it doesn't say and simplify here. Both of these would be correct answers for 22. I like the bottom one better because it's a more common way to see it written. 23 and 24 use the same skill. For 23, you're going to leave the minus sign between like I am for 24. 24, I leave the minus sign between. I multiply 7 times c, and I multiply 7 times 5. This is considered rewritten using the distributive property. Now I'll do the and simplify. I probably have both of these in my answer. The first one is the rewrite. The second one is the and simplify. Really, the and simplify part is really only the part that I'm worried about. Finally, back on track. 25 and 26 are going to solve similarly. I'm going to rewrite using the distributive property. In 26, I'm going to leave the minus between. I'm going to go y times 9 and 2 times 9. Y times 9 I would probably write as 9y. 2 times 9 I definitely write as 18. This first one is rewrite using the distributive property. And then the second one is and simplify. I have both of them in my answer. If you just gave me the 9y minus 18, that's really what I want. I rewrote it and then just kind of made it in a nice form. A bunch more problems using the distributive property because it's a hugely important property. So let me work on 28. I'm going to go leave the minus sign between and do minus 3 times y and minus 3 times 4. I'm asked to simplify this, so it implied using the distributive property. It didn't say it, but it implies it. And this now is going to be, I should write an equal sign because of what I've written equals the original problem. I'm going to simplify by doing that multiplication. Negative 3 times 4 is negative 12. And now I have a double negative. I'm going to make a positive. This is going to be the rewrite for problem 28 that I'd expect to see if this was a test question. If it asked me to simplify this, it implies using the distributive property. I take whatever in front of the parentheses in this case and distribute it through, leave the sign. 29 and 30, I can think of 2 separate ways, but for now, just to kind of be consistent, I'm going to think of this negative as having a negative 1. And I'm going to think of this using the distributive property of multiplication over subtraction. I'm going to leave the minus sign between, and I'm going to go negative 1 times 5x and negative 1 times 4y. I'm multiplying the 4x and the 4y, leaving the minus sign between. The first multiplication, I just multiply the negative 1 times 5 and get negative 5, and I leave the x. I should be writing equal signs. I'm getting lazy here, but everything I'm writing is equal to the line above it. It leaves the minus sign, and then in the second multiplication, you get negative 1 times 4 is negative 4. Leave the y. I have a double negative here, so I should have probably snuck that in a parentheses. Now this is going to be negative 5x plus 4y. Turns out the distributive property, it's not restrictive. You don't just have to have 2 terms in a parentheses. You could have 3. And I'm going to apply the distributive property to this parentheses. I'm going to leave this plus sign and the minus sign, and now I'm going to multiply 6 times 2y squared. I'm going to multiply 6 times 3y, and I'm going to multiply 6 times 9, leaving the signs between. First multiplication, I multiply the 6 and the 2, and I leave the y squared and get 12y squared. This might be more advanced than what we've done so far. I think this actually comes up in chapter 2, and I might be, getting ahead of myself, but I don't think this is that hard to follow. I might want to do a second part to this video. There's not too much left, but we're at 26 minutes. Let me peek at my answers to make sure I don't have garbage written down. Feels good. Let me do a part 2.